Good evening and welcome back to the Imaginary Gallery. Tonight's topic comes from another book that I've shown you before, In Sheep's Clothing, Understanding and Dealing with Manipulative People, and it is written by George Simon Jr., Ph.D. I thought I would share some of one of the sections of the book in part 2, Dealing Effectively with Manipulative People. It's an interesting chapter, which I will paraphrase parts of for you, which is called Recognizing the Tactics of Manipulation and Control. And he makes a distinction here in this book where he talks about defense mechanisms and offensive tactics. And we all are aware of the word defense mechanism. Genuine defense mechanisms are almost reflexive mental behaviors we may employ to shield ourselves from the threat of some kind of problem or pain. More specifically, ego defense mechanisms are mental behaviors people might use to defend these self-images from anxiety associated with societal invitations to feel ashamed or guilty about something. Dr. Simon says, there are many kinds of ego defenses, several of which are well known and have made their way into common discourse. Now, the use of defense mechanisms is one of the cardinal tenets of traditional or psychodynamic approaches to understanding with our human behavior. In fact, these types of approaches have always tended to distinguish various personality types, at least in part, by the types of ego defenses they are believed to most commonly use. And this doctor has a problem with some traditional approaches. He says that they assert that people necessarily experience guilt, shame, and anxiety when they do something that's wrong. They also claim people defend themselves against threats to their self-image by using the automatic behaviors we call defense mechanisms. Finally, they maintain that people do so unconsciously. Well, this Dr. Simon is stating that the traditional methods and models of human behavior and personality aren't helpful when it comes to understanding those who are character disturbed, which I would call toxic or cluster B. When disturbed people, characters, engage in certain behaviors, some of these that traditional therapists will call defense mechanisms, they do not do so to keep a feared event from happening. Rather, these disturbed people, these toxic people, engage in these behaviors primarily to ensure that some kind of desired event or result does happen, to manipulate and control others, and to solidify their resistance to accepting or internalizing social norms. These people use them as vehicles to keep doing what society says we shouldn't do, and as a result, they never develop that sense of guilt or shame. They engage in these behaviors consciously, even though habitual use prompts them to be employed nearly reflexively. So, many of the behaviors that we've traditionally thought were defense mechanisms more rightfully should be labeled as responsibility avoidance and tactics of manipulation and control behaviors when they're employed by disturbed characters. And then he goes into an example and says, let's discuss denial. Everybody's heard someone else say something like, oh, she's got a problem, but she's in denial about it. And this author says that most of the time this term is misused. And he states the true defense mechanism of denial is the psychological state unconsciously employed to protect a person from some horrifying, unbearable emotional pain. And then he gives a little story about Agnes, who's an elderly lady who's in pretty good health, but she was just told by her doctor that the stroke her husband of 40 years just suffered is critical and he probably will not recover. This man, Paul, has been her lover and beloved partner for most of her entire life, or at least her adult life, and she's not prepared to lose him. She faces the prospect of being alone and without his support, and life without him, she thinks, would be unbearable. So despite the fact that the brainwave charts indicate he's not probably going to make it, she stays by his side day after day after day and holds his hand, speaks to him, and insists to those who tell her, honey, he's dying. She'll say, I know he'll make it. And they say, honey, you're in denial. So she is actually in denial. She's not intentionally doing this, but unconsciously she's protecting herself from sudden and unbearable experience of losing this man and the intense grief that'll happen. So over time, when she's more psychologically prepared to suffer the trauma, her denial mechanism will break down. When it finally does, she won't have the protection that kept her from the experience of pain, and then she'll burst out into an avalanche of horrifying emotions. Now, that was the first example. He tells you to contrast this with the case of Jeff, who's a character-disturbed adolescent, called out by his junior high hall monitor because he was bullying an underclassman because he shoved the kid's books onto the floor. Nice kid. Well, the kid says, what? I didn't do anything. He is denying the behavior. But is he in a psychological state of denial? No! The classical perspective this author talks about suggests that underneath the pretense, he feels terrible about shoving that kid's books out of his hands. And number two, to defend himself against unbearable feelings of the shame and guilt that he just can't admit to himself or anyone else what he did. Or number three, he consciously has no idea what he's doing. These are dangerous presuppositions, but ones that laypersons and many professionals frequently make. They are also assumptions that, when applied to the disturbed character, are completely wrong. The more accurate perspective is that Jeff is lacking in guilt and shame or anxiety about his behavior, which is why he so unhesitatingly committed the acts in the first place of shoving that poor little kid's books out of his hands. What's also likely is that he hasn't made the commitment to deal with people in a non-aggressive way. Although other people aren't comfortable with his ways, he is. Because he's likely been chastised many times before, he is well aware that others view his behaviors as unacceptable. However, he is not prepared to submit himself to the standard of conduct others want him to adopt. He's also very aware of the likely consequences the hall monitor has in store for him. He may not want to face those consequences just as much as he doesn't want to change his style. So his best bet is to try and convince the hall monitor is that she is in error. She didn't see what she thought she saw, gaslight. That she's judged him all wrong. That she should back off. In short, when Jeff is denying, He's not defending anything. In fact, what he's really doing, like your cluster Bs, is he is mainly fighting. He's not in a psychological state. He is employing a tactic. He is very well aware of what he's doing. The tactic he's using is many times called denial, but it's really just a simple case of lying. He is lying for the reasons most people commonly lie, which is to get out of trouble. Proof positive could come when the hall monitor calls 2 or 3 other witnesses in front of him, and they all say, yes, that's what I saw, yes, that's what I saw. Jeff may then say something like, okay, I shoved him a little, but he had it coming. He's been bugging me all week. Now, the traditionalists would say he's come out of his denial. But unlike Helen, we don't see what we usually see when someone truly comes out of such a state. We do not see any pain. We don't see this Jeff break down with grief. Instead, we see him making a half-hearted admission, like when you're a kid in grade school and some evil kid knocks you over and likes it and laughs, and the teacher sees it and says, "You apologize to her right now." The kid isn't sorry. He's happy he did it, but it was like, yeah, I'm sorry. Same type of thing here. There's no sign of shame or guilt. We only see signs of defiance. And then he says the most important thing to remember about Jeff's behavior is that even though he lied quickly and automatically, like all these cluster B monsters do with a straight face, and out of habit, he didn't do it unconsciously. He knew what he was doing. Acting innocent and denying something horrible so strongly that your accuser begins to doubt the legitimacy of their complaint is one of the forms of Jeff's abundant experience, an effective combat tool. It gets him out of trouble and always seems to work for him, and he's hoping it's going to work today. Remember, behaviors that are habitual and automatic are not the same as behaviors that are unconscious. Dr. Simon tells us then that all character disordered individuals, especially aggressive personalities, use a variety of mental behaviors and interpersonal maneuvers to help ensure that they get what they want.
Give me a break. Looks aren't everything. I kind of look like Lady Gaga now. You love her, don't you? Ra ra la la la, ooh la la. Okay. Money, love, I'm free. I was thinking about you. Don't tell anyone. I was thinking about the way we used to keep it together.
Do you know what? I long for the day that you can accept people like me for being just as normal as everyone else. There's nothing wrong with us. I'm a perfect example of pure perfection in health. So I suggest that you...
Well, I finally did it. You'll never believe what squeezed out of my Virginia. Take a look at it. It's my own flesh and blood. Take a look at it. It's transhuman. It's my baby.